Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're diving into a topic you all requested, deadliest natural disasters. We're using data from Wikipedia's, it's the list of natural disasters by death toll. Prepare for some seriously huge numbers and some pretty interesting trends.
Yeah, it really puts things in perspective when you see it all laid out like this,
Yeah.
you know?
Right, so let's jump in. The source starts with the top 10, the deadliest natural disasters, BUT. They're excluding epidemics and famines for now.
Yeah.
And the number one spot, I don't know, this surprised me.
Yeah, me too.
I think a lot of people would probably guess, like a big earthquake or a tsunami.
Right.
But it's actually the 1931 China floods.
Yeah, the death toll is estimated at 4 million people. It's almost double the next one on the list.
4 million.
Yeah.
Wow. What caused such massive loss of life?
Well, it was kind of a perfect storm of factors, right? First, you've got the Yangtze River. It's one of the longest and most powerful rivers in the world. And that year, there was unusually heavy rainfall. So catastrophic flooding across this huge area. And then you add in that the region is so densely populated, millions of people living in very vulnerable areas.
Yeah. It makes you think, why don't we hear more about these 1931 floods in history?
Yeah.
I mean, it sounds like a truly massive event.
It's a good question. It could be because of, the historical context, right? The world was in the Great Depression then, and there were lots of other big problems competing for attention. Or maybe it just reflects how hard it was to document and share information back then. But whatever the reason, it shows us that even the most significant events sometimes get lost, in the bigger historical narrative.
Right. History is often told from a certain point of view, right?
Yeah.
Some things get more attention than others.
Exactly.
But getting back to the list, the other entries in the top 10, they include earthquakes, cyclones. There's even a major earthquake that hit the Byzantine Empire in 526 AD.
The Antioch earthquake killed something like 250,000 to 300,000 people. It had a massive impact on the Byzantine Empire. It's amazing how these events that we kind of just glance over in the history books, they suddenly become so real when you see how many lives were lost.
Yeah, for sure. It makes history feel more, real. Did you notice what's missing from this top 10?
Epidemics and famines.
You got it.
Yeah.
The source separates those out. Kind of interesting.
Yeah, I think it's because epidemics and famines, while they're definitely influenced by natural factors, they often involve humans a lot more,
Yeah.
and how they spread and how bad they get.
Right. Like the source is acknowledging how complicated those events are.
Exactly.
We'll come back to epidemics and famines later because they definitely deserve their own deep dive.
Yeah.
For now, let's look at how the deadliest disasters have changed over time. Looking at the 20th and 21st centuries, do you see any patterns?
Definitely. In the early 1900s, the biggest killers were cyclones and floods. Like the 1970 Bola cyclone in Bangladesh, for example, killed about 500,000 people. Coastal communities were just devastated by those storms.
So cyclones were really prominent in the early 20th century. Was that just random chance, or were there specific things making them worse or more frequent?
It's a tough question.
Ah.
Probably lots of factors, right? Climate patterns are always changing. Plus, maybe improvements in meteorology and communication started to make a difference. Better forecasting and warning systems. That's just a guess, though. You need more research to really understand it.
That's so interesting how gated can make you ask more questions than it answers. It makes you want to keep digging. But let's move on to the mid-late 20th century. Any big shifts in the types of disasters?
Mid-20th century saw a big rise in earthquake fatalities. The 1976 Tangshan earthquake in China. It killed over 240,000 people. It's a stark reminder of just how powerful those events can be.
The Tangshan earthquake. That's one you don't forget after seeing this list. What made that one so deadly? Was it just the magnitude, or are there other reasons?
Magnitude is part of it, for sure. It was a 7.8 on the Richter scale, so big. But also, it hit in the early morning, and back then they didn't have good building codes in that region. Lots of people were asleep when it hit, and buildings just collapsed.
That's heartbreaking. It shows that even when we get better at understanding earthquakes, things like building codes and preparedness are crucial.
Absolutely.
So what about the 21st century? Are earthquakes still the biggest killer?
They're still a major threat, but the 21st century also brought the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, triggered by that huge earthquake. The scale of that event, it hit so many countries in Southeast Asia, even reached parts of Africa.
Yeah. The 2004 tsunami, I remember watching the news just feeling shocked and helpless. It really affected everyone. But it makes you wonder, are these high numbers just because there are more disasters, or are we as a species getting more vulnerable?
It's a good question, and honestly, experts are still arguing about it. We have way more data now, so we're better at tracking and analyzing these events, so maybe we're just noticing them more. On the other hand, there are things like population growth, urbanization, and climate change that could be making us more vulnerable.
Yeah, it's complicated,
Yeah.
but it's something we need to talk about,
Agreed.
especially as we dig into specific types of disaster.
Exactly. And speaking of digging deeper, let's look at some of those causes from the list. We've talked earthquakes and tsunamis, but there are some fascinating things people might not even know about.
Yeah, earthquakes and tsunamis are definitely attention-grabbing.
Hmm.
But I'm curious about some of the more obscure ones on the list. Have you ever heard of, like, limnic eruptions?
Limnic eruptions. Yeah, they're pretty rare, but they can be super deadly. The 1986 Lake Nyos disaster in Cameroon is a scary example.
Exploding lakes. We definitely need to get to that.
For sure.
But before we get into the unusual stuff, let's break down the top 3 deadliest events for earthquakes, tsunamis, and yeah, those limnic eruptions. What made these particular events so deadly?
Good plan. So with earthquakes, like we said, 1976 Tangshan is at the top. Then there's the 2010 Haiti earthquake, and that one from 526, the Antioch earthquake in the Byzantine Empire.
It's wild seeing such a mix of dates, you know? Antioch way back in the 6th century AD, it shows how long humans have been dealing with earthquakes. What connects these seemingly random events? What made them so deadly?
Each earthquake is unique, but you can see some patterns. In all three, it was magnitude, location, and how vulnerable the buildings were. Tangshan was so bad because the buildings weren't earthquake resistant and it hit at night. The Haiti earthquake, it was smaller, but it hit a densely populated area with poorly built buildings. And with Antioch, we don't have all the details from that time, but probably the way they built back then was a big factor.
It really shows that we can't control when these things happen, but we can control how we prepare for them. Building codes, warning systems, disaster plans, all of that is crucial. What about tsunamis? What do we learn from the top 3 there?
Yeah, the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami is obviously the most devastating one we've seen recently. It was just so massive, and the lack of warning systems in the area made it so much worse. After that, you have the tsunami that came with the 1908 Messina earthquake in Italy, and then the one from the 1883 Krakatoa eruption in Indonesia.
Krakatoa. That's one for the history books, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Besides the obvious, the force of the water and the flooding, what makes tsunamis so deadly?
Warning time, or the lack of it. Unlike hurricanes that we can track for days, tsunamis can hit with almost no warning. People on the coast just don't have time to get away. And they move so fast, hundreds of miles an hour sometimes.
Yeah, it makes you think even places that seem safe could be vulnerable. Okay, let's get to those limnic eruptions. Lake Nyos, as you mentioned, is a scary example of what can happen. What are the other top ones in this category? What can we learn from them?
The Lake Nyos disaster is the worst limnic eruption on record. Something like 1,746 people died. Then there's the Lake Manan disaster, also in Cameroon, just a couple years before. That one is smaller, 38 deaths. There have been a few others, but those two in Cameroon really stand out.
Nature can be full of surprises, can't it?
Yeah.
But before we get into what causes these things, I want to zoom out a bit. Looking at all of these disasters, earthquakes, tsunamis, limnic eruptions, are there any patterns in terms of where they happen? Like, are some areas more prone to certain disasters?
That's where understanding plate tectonics and geography comes in. Earthquake-prone regions are usually along fault lines where the Earth's plates meet and grind together. The Pacific Ring of Fire, for example, it's like a horseshoe around the Pacific Ocean. That's where a huge percentage of the world's earthquakes and volcanic eruptions happen.
So it's not just random, it's about understanding the geology of our planet.
Right.
And what about tsunamis? Do they happen in specific areas too?
Usually, yeah. They're triggered by underwater earthquakes or volcanoes, so they happen in the same areas. Coasts along the Pacific are especially vulnerable, but like we saw with the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, they can travel thousands of miles and hit faraway places.
It's a reminder that we're all connected. What about limnic eruptions? Are they tied to specific geology too?
They're a bit different. They happen in lakes in volcanic areas where carbon dioxide from the magma leaks into the water. Over time, the gas builds up in the deeper parts of the lake.
So it's like waiting for something to set it off?
Yeah, kind of.
And what are those triggers?
Scientists are still figuring that out, but it could be things like landslides, earthquakes, even changes in the water temperature or pressure, anything that disrupts the lake and makes that gas rise to the surface.
It's fascinating, but also kind of scary thinking about these hidden dangers. But let's shift gears a little. We've talked about where and why these things happen, But I'm curious about the human element. What have we learned, or maybe haven't learned, about how to prevent these things from being so deadly in the future?
That's a huge question, one we could spend a lot of time on. But I think the most important thing is disaster preparedness.
Preparedness. What does that really mean?
It means knowing the risks where you live. Are you near a fault line, in a flood zone, on the coast where hurricanes or tsunamis could hit? Once you know the risks, you can start preparing. Put together a disaster kit, make an evacuation plan, know the warning signs, and make sure your home can withstand the forces of nature.
So being prepared is the first step. But what about bigger efforts? What can governments and organizations do to make whole communities safer?
Things like building codes, early warning systems, and better infrastructure. Stronger buildings can survive earthquakes and high winds. Warning systems can give people time to evacuate. Investing in things like seawalls, levees, and reinforced bridges can protect communities.
It sounds like it takes both individual and collective action.
Absolutely.
Let's not forget about those other disasters, the epidemics and famines. The source separates them out. Why do you think that is? Is it just a categorization thing, or is there a bigger reason?
I think it's because of how humans are involved in those events. An earthquake is purely natural, but epidemics and famines, they're often caused by poverty, sanitation, healthcare access, even political choices. It blurs the line between natural and human-made.
Right. And maybe that means we need to think differently about how to deal with those types of disasters.
Exactly.
But before we get into that, let's take a step back. We've looked at the top 10 deadliest disasters, how they've changed over time, and what makes certain areas vulnerable. What are some of the main takeaways you think our listeners should consider?
I think one of the biggest takeaways is that it's not just about the big attention-grabbing events, it's about the trends. How are these disasters changing, and what does that tell us about our world? Are we becoming more vulnerable, or are we just noticing them more? Those are important questions to think about.
It's about looking beyond the headlines, right, and understanding the bigger picture.
Exactly.
What about the human element? How does that fit into our understanding of natural disasters?
It's always there. Our choices matter. Our actions have consequences. And being prepared, both individually and as a society, can make a huge difference in how these disasters affect us.
It's a reminder that we're not just victims of nature. We have choices, and we can shape our future.
Yeah. Yeah, it's good to remember that we're not, completely helpless against nature. We can do things to make ourselves less vulnerable and build stronger communities.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But let's not sugarcoat it, right? Even with the best preparations, some of these events are just so massive. How do we even begin to grasp, like millions of lives lost? The 1931 China floods, for example. Those numbers are hard to wrap your head around.
It's tough, to truly grasp that scale of tragedy. Millions, it just becomes this abstract number. I think it helps to focus on the individual stories, the people behind those numbers.
You're right. Zoom in on the individual experiences instead of getting lost in the millions. Can you give us an example of how focusing on one story can make these events more real?
Think about the 2004 tsunami. Imagine a family, living in a coastal village, maybe celebrating a holiday. Then suddenly the sea pulls back, this eerie calm before the storm. They have minutes, maybe hours before the wave hits. Their story, their choices, their loss, that's where the real impact is.
It reminds you that these aren't just numbers on a page. They're real people, with families and hopes and dreams, lives that were changed forever. It's a powerful way to connect with the human cost of these disasters.
Exactly. And those stories are repeated millions of times over in each of these events. It's a collective tragedy that's almost impossible to imagine.
It can feel pretty overwhelming, to be honest. Knowing how powerful nature is and how much damage it can cause, where do we even start trying to make a difference?
I get it. It's a lot to take in. But I think focusing on what we can control helps. We can't prevent every earthquake or stop every cyclone, but we can make choices that make us less vulnerable and build stronger communities.
So it's about finding that balance, acknowledging the big picture, but focusing on the areas where we can actually make an impact.
Exactly. And that's where the data can be helpful, not just scary. It helps us see where our efforts can make the biggest difference, like investing in early warning systems for tsunamis so people have time to get to safety, strengthening building codes in earthquake zones can save countless lives, and doing things like sustainable land management can reduce the risk of floods.
So it's about being proactive, not just reactive, right? Thinking long term about how to reduce risk.
Absolutely. Thinking holistically, understanding that everything is connected. Our actions have consequences for ourselves and the planet.
It's not just governments and big organizations that need to act. Individuals can make a difference too, right?
Totally. Individuals are a huge part of this. It starts with being aware, knowing the risks in your area, having a disaster plan, and just making choices that help create a more resilient society. All of that matters.
So it's a combination of personal responsibility and collective action. We're all in this together.
We are. We're all part of the solution.
Okay, so we've talked about the why behind these disasters, the human impact, and the shift from reaction to prevention. Let's go back to the list for a minute. Were there any facts or events that really stood out to you? Anything surprising?
I was struck by the sheer variety of disasters on the list. We tend to think about the big ones like earthquakes, tsunamis, hurricanes, but there are so many other things people might not even consider. Landslides, for example. They can be incredibly destructive, especially in mountains. Volcanic eruptions, they happen less often than earthquakes, but they can have huge impacts, like Krakatoa in 1883. And then there are those weird limnic eruptions. Nature always finds a way to surprise us.
Speaking of Krakatoa, I was also really interested in the historical events on the list. It's cool to see how natural disasters have been shaping civilizations for centuries.
It's important to remember that these events aren't new. Humans have been dealing with nature's power for a long time. And those stories from the past, they have lessons for us today.
Yeah, like the 526 AD earthquake that destroyed Antioch. Even the most powerful societies can be brought down by these events.
Exactly. It shows you how history and geography are intertwined. Where we live, how we build, the choices we make, it's all influenced by nature, the past and the present.
It's like a hidden history lesson right there in the data. It reminds us that we're part of this much bigger story, this story that's been going on for centuries and will continue long after we're gone.
It's humbling, right? To realize we're just one small part of this ongoing story.
It is. But it's also inspiring, to think about all the challenges humanity has faced and overcome. It gives me hope that we can find solutions to the problems we face today.
I agree. It's about learning from what came before us, adapting to the present, and building a stronger future.
So we've covered a lot, the science, the history, the human impact, all of it. But there's one more layer I think we need to explore, the psychological and emotional effects of these disasters. It's easy to focus on physical destruction, but the mental and emotional wounds can be just as devastating.
That's such an important point and often overlooked. People focus on the immediate needs after disaster. But the trauma, the grief, the anxiety, those things can last long after the cleanup is done.
It's like a ripple effect, going way beyond the people who were directly affected. Their families, their communities, even those of us watching the news from afar. We all feel it in some way.
Absolutely. Fear, helplessness, even guilt. Those are all normal reactions. We need to acknowledge those feelings, create space for healing and support, and understand that recovery takes time.
It's not just about rebuilding homes and roads, it's about rebuilding lives, communities, and that sense of hope.
Exactly. And it's a reminder that we need each other. When disasters happen, it's our shared humanity, our empathy, our willingness to help that gets us through it. We need to support each other, not just in the moment, but for the long haul.
That's a great message of unity and hope. But let's be real for a second. There will always be challenges, setbacks, and even disagreements about how to do things. How do we deal with all of that and still work together toward a more resilient future? How do we find common ground when there's so many different views and priorities?
That's where communication comes in. Being willing to listen to each other and collaborate, even when we don't agree on everything. It's about finding that common ground, understanding that there's no one right answer, and learning from each other's experiences.
Yeah, it's about building bridges instead of walls.
Right. It's about knowing we're all in this together, and that even when things are really tough, human ingenuity, compassion, and working together can make a difference.
Yeah, it's about choosing hope over despair, action over inaction, and unity over division.
You said it well. And honestly, I think those are the values that should guide us, not just when we're talking about natural disasters, but when we're dealing with any of the world's big problems.
And it's all about recognizing that we're all human, and we have to work together to create a world that's more just and equal and sustainable. A world where we're not always reacting to crises, but thinking ahead and building a better future for ourselves and future generations.
A vision worth fighting for. And I think it's achievable if we put our minds to it.
It is inspiring to think about the potential we have, even when things look really bleak. So, bringing it back to our listener, what's the one thing you hope they take away from this deep dive into these deadliest disasters?
I hope they get a sense of awareness, but also empowerment. Awareness of the risks out there for all of us, and that they can make choices that make things better for themselves and their communities. It's not just about sitting back and watching. They can be part of the solution.
It's about knowledge and action. You can know the risks, but you got to be willing to do something about them.
Right.
And to support efforts to make the world safer and more sustainable.
Yeah, and it's important not to forget the human side of things. Behind all the numbers, all the data, there are stories of loss and resilience and people helping each other. We can't forget those stories because they can inspire us, motivate us, guide us.
They remind us that even in the worst situations, people can still be amazing. So wrapping up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with this thought. We've looked at the past, talked about the present, even peeked into the future. But the big question is, what role will each of us play in that future? What choices will we make? What will we do? The answers to those questions are inside each of us, They're in our hearts, in our minds, and in our willingness to step up and be the change we want to see in the world.
Those are the answers that will change the course of history. It's up to all of us to choose wisely, act boldly, and work together to create a world where natural disasters don't have to turn into human tragedies. A world where we can live in harmony with nature, respecting its power, but also using our intelligence and compassion to build a better future.
Thanks for joining us on this journey of discovery. Until next time, keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep making a difference.